Hello, everybody. This is Shane Douglas Keene, and I'm joined by my partner in crime, Rich Duncan. We are Ink Heist, and tonight we are speaking with author Alan Baxter. And man, we have a lot to talk about. Alan, go ahead and introduce yourself for anybody who doesn't know you, and some of your books and whatnot, and we'll get into this thing.
Sure. Okay. Yep. So I'm Alan. I write mostly horror, a lot of dark fantasy and crime sort of mashed up into that. I live in Tasmania, which is the island off the south of Australia, which is actually part of Australia. I only discovered recently that some people seem to think that Tasmania is a different country, but that's still Australia. It's just one of the Australian states. Moved down here about a year or so ago from New South Wales. I've written books like the Alex Keene series, which is sort of a dark urban fantasy, urban horror sort of mashup series, and then more recently books like Sallow Bend and Blood Covenant, which are more in the folk horror kind of vibe. And I've got a new old book coming out in about a month called Recall, which is an omnibus edition of the 3 Eli Carver novellas that were published between, I think, 2018 and 2021. 3 separate novellas told a big story, and Subalo Books are putting them together is an awesome big chunky omnibus edition collecting all 3 together, which comes out in February, end of February.
And I can attest to the fact that if you have not read those books, you want that when it comes out. Go pre-order that fucker.
Thank you.
Yeah, especially not to spoil it for anyone, but the third one especially. I forget which one of the recalls that was.
Ghost Recall was third. It was Manifest Recall, and then it was Recall. Manifest. Make sure Manifest Recall, Recall Night, and then Ghost Recall were the 3 novellas, and the put together is just called Recall.
So because I have them on my shelf, and I was looking at them for the word or two, the one Ghost Recall, that one especially, they're all fantastic, but that one I think is my personal favorite. I don't know about you, Shane.
I can't really say I have a favorite. It's kind of like when I think about them, the first one is always the one that immediately jumps up, because that's where I met Eli Carver, and it just really resonated with me. But otherwise, I don't know. I can't say that I have a favorite.
Sorry, I was going to say it's interesting the way those ones came together, because I normally know what I'm writing. Like if I start work on a project, I'm normally well aware if I'm writing a short story or if I'm starting on a novel or whatever. Every once in a while, something surprises me. And with Manifest Recall, the first one, I sat down to write a short story. And as I was working on it, it very quickly became apparent that it was a lot bigger than a short story. And I was like, oh shit, okay, maybe I'm writing a novel actually here. This is a much bigger idea. And I kind of reshaped my thinking. And then it kind of came round and settled into that novella territory. It's just a little under 40,000 words, I think. It's a short novel novella. And at the time, it was just the one idea. But by the time I got to the end of that, I was thinking, well, fuck, I can find a publisher, and I hope there's a publisher that likes this, because I want to write more Eli Carver stories. And so thankfully that's what happened. And so subsequently I got to keep expanding out the idea through Recall Night and then Ghost Recall, and then the 3 of them together. I think it makes about 120,000 words or something all up. So it's like a big sort of solid story. And it's kind of complete as it stands. It would be nice at some point potentially to write more Eli Carver stories, but it's ended up becoming good. And like talking about Rich with Ghost Recall, sort of everything that was building sort of played towards that. And so got to have a lot of fun with those sort of things.
And that's the thing, is I can't see how it could have been just the one novella, just because when you created Eli Carver, you created a well of ideas and inspiration there. I kind of felt like, it's like even me as the reader was going, and then next we could have him do this and have this scenario.
Exactly. It's a bit like that. You suddenly find all these things that you could follow up on. What about if I put him in this place? And what about if I put him in that place? It's interesting that I'm a little bit tempted now. I mean, there's absolutely nothing planned or organized at this point, but now that because the novellas went out of print and then Cyberlo Books picked them up for this omnibus edition. So it's exciting that they're getting back out in the world. Hopefully we'll get some sort of new readers and whatnot. And it's kind of given me the thought that I can get back to potentially writing more Eli stories. And it's like, well, maybe off the back of the original three novellas are now collected effectively into a novel. It's like I could potentially now write an Eli Carver novel. Like there's the potential there now to write a novel length next sort of installment in the Eli Carver books. So yeah, like I say, nothing's planned or anything like that, but it's nice to have that thought in mind that if Recall comes out and people sort of get behind it again and people still enjoy it, I could start considering an actual Eli Carver novel next, deliberately written as a novel.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that too, because they all came out, like you said, in standalone novellas, and like you had mentioned, it was kind of like you did the one and then you thought like, okay, I can expand it. But it's interesting now that you say it's coming out as like an omnibus, and because part of it, I guess you could say like you kind of have to, just in case. I know they were written kind of as like a series but standalone.
Yeah.
Is that it's almost like, even though they were separate, coming out in an omnibus, I could see that reading almost like a novel. So I don't know if, did you for this edition, like it's a true omnibus, like it's this book and there's clear like delineations, or is it kind of changed a little bit so it reads like that, like a continuous novel?
Yeah, it's changed a little bit. We talked a lot about this, myself and some of the guys at Sobolo. We talked about how to put this together to make it work, and basically what we've done. So originally when the novellas were originally released, Manifest Recall, the first one, was just in two parts. There was part one, part two, and it basically split more or less right in the middle, because all sorts of stuff goes on. There's a significant sort of event middle of the book, and then you sort of get the second half, and that worked for Manifest Recall as its own, as a standalone, which at the time I didn't know if there would be any more. That might have been the whole story, and that was enough. But then I did get to expand it when I wrote Recall Night. That one just sort of goes then now, because it's telling a story about how things, you're getting flashbacks of what's going on and then bringing to the present, and then it sort of continues from there. And then the third one with Ghost Recall, it was written more in a standard structure that had just chapters, 1, 2, 3, 4 chapters as it went along. So the structure of each of them was a little bit different like that. And so what we decided in the end was to, as we were putting them together, we decided that it would work better as sort of a novel in 3 parts. So I went back and I've re-edited through all 3 books and divided all 3 into chapters. So right from the start, from Manifest Recall, it opens with chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4. You still obviously have that significant point in the middle, but it's not, that's the start of a new chapter. It's divided. So we get Recall and we get part 1, Manifest Recall, chapters 1 to 20 or something. And then you get part 2, Recall Night, chapter 21 to 40, and then you get part 3, Ghost Recall, chapter 41 to 60, or how, I can't remember the exact numbers. So we have sort of restructured it to be like that. So it has been, even though it's in 3 sort of distinct sections with little sort of skip forwards, time events of each part, it has been structured to actually read like a novel with consecutive chapters now, and you just sort of get 3 parts that identify which were the original books. And so we are sort of, we've deliberately made it more as a novel and to read like a novel experience now. That's the plan.
And it makes sense to do it that way, kind of, because it's not uncommon to do a novel in 3 acts,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. And almost within each part, because each novel, because it was written as a standalone at the time, each novella has its own arc, and within those 3 novellas, there's obviously the arc across the series of the 3. So it kind of loops like that. You get these highs and lows going through, and by each part builds on the part that came before. And so it does end up being sort of like bit of a more complicated 3-act structure in that respect, you know, in that each novella is one of them. Yeah.
So tell us about Blood Covenant. Sorry.
Blood Covenant. So that was the novel that came out in May. That's the latest.
Mm-hmm.
The latest thing from me. Cemetery Dance published Sallow Bend in 2023, and then in May this year they put out Blood Covenant. Oh, there it is. There you go. Francois Valancourt artwork on the cover, who also did the cover for Sallow Bend. Just amazing cover art, such an amazing artist. So huge thanks to Francois for that. Blood Covenant is the story of. It's a tricky one. It's a tricky one to sort of encapsulate without sort of giving too much away. Basically, there's a gang of idiots who travel from Sydney down into the country to pull a bank heist because they think it's going to be easy. But it goes horribly wrong very quickly, and they go on the run, and they're looking for a place to hide out until the heat's off, and they see a sign for a remote hotel that's closed for the season. So they're like, we'll go there, we'll hang out, we'll figure out what's going to happen next. But just as they get there, the family who run the hotel have just turned up to start organizing things ready to open for the season. So instead of finding a quiet place to hole up, the gang suddenly find themselves in a hostage situation, and they take the hostage family. And some blood is spilled in the process of that. And with the spilling of blood in this old place in the mountains in the Australian bush, something old and malevolent sort of wakes up. The sort of tagline initially when I was pitching the book was, what if a violent home invasion wasn't the worst thing that happened today? And that's kind of where it goes to. And it's fundamentally, it's a story about family. There's the Moore family who run the hotel, who are a regular family taking care of each other. And then there's the gang from Sydney, who are a bunch of miscreants and misfits who are sort of found family. And it's, you know, how far people will go to look out for themselves and look out for each other and all that against the face of this kind of horrendous supernatural threat that is an equal threat to all of them. So yeah, and it's, for a nerdy point of view, for people who've read The Gulp and The Fall, those are books where I sort of created this fictional geography on the south coast of New South Wales. It's kind of like my Castle Rock. It's where I get to play with all this weird and wacky stuff. And while Blood Covenant is not a Gulp story, it is in the same universe. The bank heist happens in Endon, which is one of the towns next to Culpeper in the Gulp mythos, and there's a couple of mentions in it. So I dropped these sort of Easter eggs. So yes, Australian sort of bush horror, supernatural horror with links to the Culpeper mythos. So
and I mean, pardon me for segueing into fandom repeatedly when you say something, but the Gulp is a fascinating universe, and if you have not read those books, you absolutely have to read the Gulp and the Fall, and the rest of the ones Alan's eventually going to write for us in that series.
Yeah, there'll be more. There'll be more. I've actually started. I wrote a whole blog post about it because people were asking. So the sort of the Culpeper mythos and where it crops up, because it's something I've started, because I'm a nerd for this stuff myself. I love the Easter eggs and all the little sort of thing. Oh, I know that guy, or I know that place. So I've sort of made a point of listing all the short stories that have been published that are in or around the Culpeper mythos. I had a novella published last year by Pierce Publishing called The Leaves Forget, which is set here in Tasmania and got nothing to do with Culpeper, except there's a band in the Gulp books called Blind Eye Moon, and one of the characters in The Leaves Forget wears a Blind Eye Moon ball cap and stuff like that. So I'm always dropping these little sort of hints and cross references and stuff. So I really love that stuff, and I'll be writing a lot more in and around the Gulp. I've got a new novel that's with my agent at the moment. That's a whole novel that's set in Moncton, which is there's Culpeper in the middle, there's Endon to the north, and Moncton to the south. And a whole novel set in Moncton, which is its own whole standalone novel, but one of the characters is basically a refugee from the events at the end of The Fall. So there's a lot of sort of reference to what happened there. So I'm getting to play a lot with that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and like Shane said, kind of with the Eli Carver thing, it's got to be nice too, because like, especially once you kind of establish that town as like such a unique entity, like it makes it a little bit easier. Like you can come up with ideas a little bit easier because it's connected to this place that's so richly developed. So it's like, it's always kind of like a source of inspiration because you developed it so much that then you just constantly think about what's going on there.
Yeah, that's it. And I don't have to, like, if I set stuff in the Goldpepper universe, I don't have to sort of repeatedly create new fictional areas. If I don't want something to be set in anywhere particularly recognizable, then it can be in Endon or Moncton or Goldpepper or nearby. Because yeah, I've got this place that I can just continually expand the mythos. In fact, with Recall, the Eli Carver stories are technically in the mythos as well, because in the original, in Manifest Recall, they come across this motorcycle gang called the Desert Ghosts, who they have these run-ins with. And interestingly enough, so I wrote a short story called Served Cold, which was and it's the title story of my second collection called Served Cold. And I needed a biker gang for that story, so I created the Desert Ghosts, which are this sort of fictional bike gang that initially were out in outback New South Wales. When I was then writing Manifest Recall, just for a bit of a laugh, I thought that I would use the same gang in America. I thought that'll be fun. So I used the second. I mean, I don't want to write about real motorcycle gangs and implicate them in the stuff that these people were doing. Let's get a fictional one. So the Desert Ghosts appeared in Eli Carver. Subsequently, the stories around the story Served Cold and stuff like that have now got linked to Goldpepper and the Goldpepper mythos. Therefore, that the whole thing feeds back. So the Desert Ghosts are a motorcycle gang that exist in the Goldpepper universe. So therefore, Eli Carver, even though it's set in America, starts in New Orleans and everything else, it's technically part of the Goldpepper mythos because it's got that link to it. It's got the Desert Ghost link. So yeah, so it's kind of fun to play around with all this stuff.
Yeah, and that kind of the roundabout way between that and talking about Eli Carver and stuff brings me right back to Blood Covenant, and that is the first time I met Eli Carver, we were in a really, really violent situation. And the first time I meet James Glenn and co, when I first open up Blood Covenant, yeah, we're in that same kind of there's what would I call an in-your-face hook that you can't ignore and you don't want to thing. Yeah. And that's something you've always been a master of, is writing a really good fight scene, whether it's a gunfight or hand to hand or whatnot. But talk about your philosophy on that, on the hook.
It's interesting, isn't it? The Eli Carver books are very violent books, and Recall now, as it is as a standalone novel, is just packed with violence. Like Eli Carver, as the second part opens, the first line of Recall Night was, "My name is Eli Carver, and I am not a nice man." It's like he was sort of born and created in an incredibly violent environment, and that's how he sort of deals with the world. And that's what a lot of the exploration in that story is him coming to terms with who and what he is, and then trying to decide who he really wants to be. And so there's a lot of violence in those books, very much with Blood Covenant. That is probably by far the most violent opening to a book I've ever done, because that there's two real threads to that story, which one is the gang and everything going wrong for them with the bank robbery, and the other side of it is whatever it is that they wake up when they try to hide out up in the remote lodge that they go to. And so trying to find sort of balance between those two story threads was actually quite difficult, that trying to make that novel work in keeping those two things working together. But one of the things that sort of made it work, and one of the things that set the tone, was that you find out right away, right from literally the opening paragraph, kind of who and what this gang are. And hopefully, if I did a good enough job of it, you very quickly, because you meet this gang of robbers, the 5 of them initially, and hopefully you very quickly get this sort of snapshot of who they are and how they operate, and it becomes very apparent very quickly that sort of James is this controlling force of this gang, and everyone is basically being dragged along in his wake. And that's a lot of the driving force for that part of the story. And so, like, I wanted that book to open with a bang, like, and to there is a much slower way to have opened it with, you know, sort of more introductions to things. You take a book like Sallow Ben, for example, which sort of opens with a couple of missing teenagers, and it's like people are talking about it, they're coming together, they're looking for the teenagers, and then the book sort of starts to gain momentum as things happen. Blood Covenant's the opposite. Blood Covenant just explodes in your face, and then you just got to try to keep up, that was kind of the idea that I wanted. And it slows down then later as things sort of settle and people start trying to figure out what they're going to do. There's room later on to breathe. So yeah, there are different ways to do things. I think more often than not, an interesting hook and a slower build is sort of easier in some ways to write, whereas a book like Blood Covenant, where you just smash someone straight in the face right from the outset and hope that you can drag them along, in some ways I think is potentially harder to write. But yeah, hopefully I did an all right job of it. That was the plan anyway.
Yeah, it's that's the thing of what I was referring to earlier with the so-called fight choreography, is that, yeah, it all happens very, very quickly, but as you say, yeah, it's really violent. It's kind of, you know, a little, it's kind of bloody, you know, but that's not the point. The point is that within this space that feels like about 30 seconds of real time, you come out of the bank with those characters pretty much, like you say, knowing how each one of them is going to react to a situation and how each one of them actually feels about the situation they're in right now. And you even have a feel of backstory, you know, even though it's mostly the reader generating that, you know. And
it reminds me of that, you know, the scene in Blade Runner where Deckard's basically being told about the crew. They're like, you know, this is Zora, talk about Beauty and the Beast, she's both. And then they sort of, you know, they give this, they literally show a photo and give a snapshot of each of the replicants. So this is who you're hunting, this is who you know, Roy Batty, undoubtedly the leader. It's like, it's kind of like, I mean, that really worked well in Blade Runner because, you know, he's literally being given the job and these are the case files kind of thing. And for me, a lot of the time things need to work a little bit like that. You need to be able to write something that isn't as blatant, but basically comes across as getting case files of who you're dealing with. So you've got no real detail. You don't really know any sort of ins and outs or any depth. It's very superficial to start with, but you do get that snapshot. This is this person, they're a bit like that. This person, they're a bit like that. And so you've got something just to hook into that carries you along. And then, you know, you very quickly decide who you care about and who you don't. And, you know, at the very least, you get some sort of grip mentally of a dynamic within a group, because an ensemble cast is kind of difficult to manage in a book. And with Blood Covenant, there's two, because there's the gang and there's the family. And, you know, either one of those as an ensemble cast through a novel, you need to manage all the different personalities and stuff like that. But managing two groups like that and interacting with each other, and that made that book difficult to write. But yeah, as you say, with that opening, it was very much a case of, right, this is who this lot are, bang. And the family is sort of then introduced, the next chapters of them driving up towards the lodge, and, you know, one car following the others, and they're chatting on walkie-talkies, and then there's a much lower key version of a similar thing, you know, getting that snapshot of who each person is, so that by the time that they come together at the house, which is where the sort of story starts, at the hotel, I should say, by then you kind of have a grip on who they all are, at least superficially, whereas starting the story there would be very difficult to introduce all those ensemble parts.
Yeah, you'd end up doing a whole lot of telling instead of the showing that you actually to make that happen. Yeah. much more effective, I think. Rich?
I was just gonna say, kind of, because Alan had mentioned how it was challenging. Um, I was curious, did this story always start kind of as like you kind of had both halves going into it and you knew you wanted to kind of blend those, or did it kind of start off more as one and then at working on that idea? So like let's say it was originally a James and his gang piece, but then you came up with the other part of it after. Was it like that where you came up with like one half first and then it led to the other, or did you always have both to start?
Um, for me, a novel comes together when a novel is not an idea. A novel is several ideas, and my brain is just full of shit all the time. There's stuff swirling around in there all the time. And I've got all sorts of ideas for for scenes, for plots ideas, for characters, and all these different things. And for me, a novel comes together when two or three of those ideas that are knocking around start orbiting each other a little bit more focus, and they come together. It's like, oh, hang on, this person and that idea and this place or whatever. Now there's a story, there's a book. And it was a bit like that with this. I knew in the first instance, and it's also what made it difficult. In the first instance, I knew that I basically wanted to write something that was fundamentally a home invasion story. And I wanted to have a situation where instead of it being like one psycho going into a house with one person or something like that, I wanted it to be a bunch of people. So I wanted it to be a gang doing sort of a home invasion to a number of people in a house. I mean, Tremblay did a brilliant job of that with the Cabin at the End of the World, where he had that sort of group, and it was a small family. It was the two dads and their daughter, but it was the group that sort of it was a bit like that. There was that was sort of the idea knocking around, is that I wanted one group and another group to clash in a home invasion. So that idea from the outset was, I knew something I wanted to explore in a book. But then it sort of came together subsequently then when the idea of the supernatural entity and the waking the thing up, and the idea that there was a bigger threat. So while these two groups were the central part of it, and the family was a great threat from the gang, when the idea of the sort of supernatural part of this came up, and so that both the gang and the family were equally threatened by this other thing, and it's all the sort of push-pull of that, that's when this sort of grew into a book. And that's where it's like, okay, this is a novel I can write. Now I've got sort of a shape for it. And that's where it's like, okay, so the bank robbery goes wrong, they go, but there's the home invasion, and then this other part comes in. And that's when it started working as a bigger idea. But it also is what made it difficult. This was, to be honest, probably the hardest book I've written to date. It took three tries to write this book, and even to the degree where I put it aside, wrote an entire other book, and then came back to it. I wrote the first draft of Blood Covenant before I wrote Sallow Bend. Now I wrote Sallow Bend, and it was published, and that whole period of time and everything that goes on before I finally managed to get Blood Covenant right. So the first draft of it was before that, and then subsequently it was really broken in trying to make the plot balance and work. And I finally sort of figured it out, but it took a long time. But this is a long way to answer your question. But the short version is basically the idea of the gang on family home invasion was one idea. That was something I knew I wanted to do. When I came up with the idea of the hotel and the bush up in the mountains and the supernatural sort of threat on the other part of it, that's when it became something I could start working on. That's when I started writing it.
Awesome. Yeah, because I was curious about that, because Shane and I were talking earlier. And Shane had mentioned, and I agreed, because kind of like with Eli Carver, we're like, man, the opening scene, because Shane and I read a book together called by Ali Say, I Think I'm Alone Now, and we were talking about that on our year-end wrap-up about great hooks. And we both like that bank robbery scene, we both picked that because it was so well developed, and we both were like, man, I wonder if Alan would ever write like a straight ahead crime story. Shane in particular was like, he needs you to do one, and I agreed with him. So, but that's why I was interested in what kind of came first, because like like I would have thought maybe like the whole James part kind of, and then like maybe it started as that, and it seems like, you know, that was the two groups that you kind of started with that and then developed it into it. It was interesting to hear that.
Yeah. Interesting talking about doing straight crime as well, because I wrote an entire novel that had absolutely no supernatural elements in it, basically because someone said I couldn't do it. And I'm nothing if not up for a challenge. And it turned out to be really, because I wrote what is basically a sort of psychological thriller. And it's a good book and it's a good story. But ironically, my agent then was like, this needs a supernatural element. This needs more horror, and you can do this and you can do that. And she didn't say it in exactly those words, but that's what it basically boiled down to, is, you know, you need a supernatural vibe to this one. And when I went back and added it in, it's really subtle, but it's there now. And it, you know, people are annoying when they're right, but it's a better book. So yeah, but I think in terms of, like, Eli Carver books are probably the closest thing to straight crime that I've got so far, although there's obviously the whole supernatural element of all the other stuff that goes on. But at their core, they're crime books about organized crime and gangs and that sort of stuff. At some point, I probably will write something that's more straight crime. I'm a huge fan of Tom Picarelli and the sort of stuff that he, like the Cold Spot and stuff like that, just blow my mind as books. And I'm, yeah, at some point I think it will probably happen that I will write something like that, but I always have too much fun with these weird horror and supernatural elements and stuff, and I always end up sort of falling back to those because, yeah, it's just good fun.
Keep talking for a few minutes, guys. I gotta go help my wife carry some stuff because our grocery delivery just showed up.
No worries.
Sure.
Give me 3 minutes.
Yeah. So yeah, that yeah, we were both talking about that. So yeah, it was kind of interesting too, but you know, it's funny how you said it was almost like you did write that and then you brought the other in, because that was kind of like even the genesis just for our show, is Shane and I both, you know, reviewed a lot of horror and primarily horror, but then we also found ourselves being drawn to crime. So like hearing, you know, about your process with the Carver novels and even Laird Barron and Tom Picarelli and stuff, I find it interesting because Shane and I always saw a lot of crossover in those two genres. So it's kind of cool to like see other authors, like they seem like a natural pairing, but how many horror writers are also into that as well?
Yeah, I mean, crime and horror are kind of the same thing to me. It's only when we have conversations like this, or I read reviews and things, that they end up sort of being more drawn out and separate. Because even without a supernatural element, crime novels are horror stories, because, you know, people are doing shitty things, people are getting killed or dying. You know, that there's the only difference really between crime and horror is not really the horror, but it's how much of a supernatural element may or may not be involved. Because the most mundane non-supernatural crime novels can get super dark. It's crime because it's, you know, because of the genre. And that, to my mind, you know, that's also a horror novel. With Manifest Recall, throughout the whole of that book, one of the sort of key motifs of the book is the reader is never sure for certain whether the ghosts that constantly sort of harangue and follow Eli around, in the entirety of Manifest Recall, it's entirely ambiguous whether they are actually ghosts or just a part of Eli's ongoing psychosis. As the stories go on, things get more and more bonkers, and the supernatural element is absolutely, you know, not in question, but by the end of Ghost Recall in particular. But one of the things I was doing with Manifest Recall was deliberately playing with that ambiguity of, to some degree, you know, the fact that Eli's sort of the ultimate unreliable narrator, really, because the book opens with him having no idea where he is or what he's doing or how he got there. He basically just remembers the car he's sitting in, and he doesn't even know why there's a girl sort of on the seat next to him. He has no idea who she is. Like, anything sort of he remembers during the course of it, any part of his recall, is questionable. And so, you know, the existence of his ghost is easily part of his psychosis. And even when I was writing it, I wasn't 100% certain whether I was going to play more into that story, whether they were genuine ghosts or whether they were just an aspect of Eli's sort of psyche. And I didn't answer the question in Manifest Recall, and it was only when I got to write further installments in those Eli Carver books that I drew that out. And interestingly, sort of in some ways, taking feedback from readers, a lot of reviews were like, far out, we need to know if these are really ghosts. I really want these to really be ghosts. I really want this to be, you know, these need to be expanded more and more. And it's kind of that cemented for me. It's like, yeah, good, because I want them to be real ghosts as well. So it was kind of that reader feedback from book one that kind of triggered that made me know that was the right direction to go, basically. So, but you know, the first Eli Carver book, part one of Recall, in Manifest Recall, effectively is a straight crime novel. Like, there's one moment right towards the end where you're like, oh, hang on a minute, was that actually evidence of ghosts or not? And even then it's ambiguous. So in some ways that is the straight crime book that I've written so far, even though, as it turns out, the ghosts are real. But yeah, crime is fascinating to me. Crime and horror are the same genre, and it's just how much of any one thing you lean into that sort of establishes, yeah, where it goes. I get kind of, I don't know, I don't like categorizing and putting. I never met a genre I didn't like. You know, there's horror, there's fantasy, there's magic, there's crime, there's mystery. Like, I just cram it all into those things. It's, you know, the only things I tend not to do are romance and erotica. Otherwise, if there's a genre, you'll probably find it somewhere in my work.
Yeah, and I'm glad when you said that you were like the reader feedback about wanting them to be ghosts. I think I was definitely one of those people. But what's interesting is, you know, even though it was kind of the plan, and like a lot of your books, like Blood Covenant kind of is that horror and crime mix, and the Eli Carver novels is, you know, recently, like, I've started writing my own stuff and sending it out there, but I'm reading Tim Wagner's Writing in the Dark, but it's like the workbook edition.
Yeah.
And the one like lesson was like, I think it was like even the second chapter was kind of like, you know, when you're doing like a supernatural thing or any of that darkness, that whole ambiguity thing. And like, he kind of talks about like, oh, you know, you might want to play up certain, you know, senses and kind of not explain everything. And I think that was one of my favorite parts of like Blood Covenant, is that because you have these two different threats, you know, the real world threat and the supernatural, it's almost like it kind of allows you to be a little bit more ambiguous with, you know, maybe the supernatural stuff.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if that was the way you kind of wrote it, like if you would, since you had kind of two halves, the crime and the horror, did it change the way that you kind of crafted the tension because you knew you had, you know, like the tension from, you know, the home invasion to kind of, did that allow you to kind of draw out kind of like, without giving it away, to draw out kind of more about what actually was going on in the whole, you know? Yeah. I think you know what I'm getting at. I don't want to spoil it.
Like, I could have written that book without the supernatural element. That could have been a home invasion crime novel, which would still have been a horror novel because of just the fact that James was just so psychotic. And it's clear that, again, without giving too much away, even without the supernatural element, it becomes apparent. It's a point in the story when it sort of becomes apparent to other members of his gang that he's reacting to something else in his life which is driving him to these extremes, and they realize they've got pulled along in this. And with the home invasion and the family under threat and everything else, then I could have written that without the supernatural element. That could have been the story, which, because at the point when the sort of a key part for people who haven't read it yet, is that when the gang turn up to the house and discover the family are already there, and then the gang takes the family hostage, the one thing they don't realize is the teenage son is out in the bush. Like when the family got there, he'd been sitting in the car for hours. They're like, go play, and he's got a tree house out there. And so he fucked off while they started unpacking stuff. And when the gang take the family hostage, they don't realize this teenage kid is out there. And it's sort of up to him to try to figure out what's going on. And I did, in some ways it's up to him to save his family. And that's another thing that I was exploring in the book, is that a lot of the time 13-year-old kids are crap at that. They're not going to be very good at being the ones responsible for saving their family. It's coming of age in that respect, but a lot of the time kids do dumb stuff and they get scared and they can't do things. And that's a lot of what's explored in the story. The kid's called Ruben. A lot of what Ruben can and can't do is driving force in that story as well. And that whole situation could have been a novel in itself without the supernatural element. It was adding the supernatural element which became a threat to all of them, and made the threat against the family double, because they had this gang holding them hostage, but the family, particularly the grandfather, were a little bit more aware of the greater threat a lot sooner than the gang were. And so I got to really sort of play up a lot of those dynamics and those character dynamics of people sort of, like the mother of the family trying to make an emotional connection with the one woman in the gang and stuff like that. A lot of that was really interesting stuff to play with. And I really enjoyed a lot of that writing process that was nothing to do with the supernatural threat, but was just to do with the dynamics of the interplay between those two groups of people. I've had a lot of people talk about, there's a part in it where Clay, the grandfather, there's a part in it where he goes on this monologue about getting older and, this without giving too much away. And I've had so much feedback on that particular scene that people really enjoyed about it. And a lot of people have come and talked to me about that, or messaged me about that, having read the book. And that sort of stuff is things that I really enjoyed with this book. And the supernatural threat is what lifted the novel up into being more of a horror novel, not just a crime novel, and was the bigger threat that I needed to catalyze everything else that was sort of going on. This is why it was a really freaking hard book to write, because balancing that stuff up became really difficult, and I kept fucking it up, and I kept having to rebalance things. And
but yeah, it's interesting. I've been reading a lot about screenwriting recently, and one of the things that gets repeated quite frequently is I forget who the author is of the book I was reading just the other day, but it was like what he thought of as micro conflicts, in the cases of ensemble casts, and then that overarching, okay, what ties all of these people together? What about these bad guys and these good guys, and their separate problems? What brings them together and makes them, have that overarching conflict?
Yeah. The two things are really interesting to play with, because one of the things I've been doing this a while now, quite a few sort of stories written, and a lot of what I've been learning over the process of it is that you mentioned Laird Barron earlier on, and Laird Barron was talking about suspension of disbelief in an interview once, and he said, I paraphrase, I can't remember exactly, but he said, get the small stuff right and I'll follow you off the cliff. And that's true when you're writing for sort of supernatural and fantastical stuff. If you want people to believe the absolutely bloody absurd, get the real stuff right and compelling and get the detail right, and they'll just, if people are along with you for the ride on that stuff, they'll follow you no matter how sort of crazy it gets, you know. And that's always stuck with me as being really important in terms of good storytelling. And as I was saying, having done this time and time again, the thing that I've learned is more often than not, it's getting that interplay between characters right, which is the bedrock of all of that. The way, you know, if characters act a certain way, they can't all act a similar way. They can't all be a reflection of the author. You can't have all the bad guys are bad guys. You know, there's with Blood Covenant and the gang, James is obviously fucking psychotic. Like, and there's, you know, you learn a little bit more about what's been going on for him as things go on. And he's also incredibly charismatic, and Paul is his younger brother, so there's an obvious connection there. The brother's carrying along the others in the gang. It's like, why are they there? Why are they following this nutcase? And exploring the fact that, you know, it wasn't necessarily always like this, and they've got shared history, and they've had tough upbringings, and they're found family, and all this sort of stuff. Selling that stuff and selling those interplays was integral to making the novel work, because otherwise you wouldn't believe everything else that goes on. Like you'd just be like, no, I'm not buying it. So yeah, that stuff to me is really important. In particular, that interplay between characters, especially when you've got sort of ambiguous bad guys. Who's really the bad guy? Like with Blood Covenant, it's very obvious. The gang are the bad guys, the family are the good guys, and then there's a supernatural threat. But within those family dynamics, there's different interplays, there's different stuff going on. So, and it's important to get all that right. And the more of that you get right and interesting and compelling, the more you can sell any amount of absolute crazy bonkers nonsense you want to get in there. So
go ahead, Rich.
I was just going to say, like, kind of like with the believability, and also because earlier when you were talking about the one section, it was funny about Clay and what he said. That's why I kind of like threw my arms up, because that was the one thing I was going to ask you is, like, that seemed, I think maybe, and I don't know if this is how it was written, but I think the reason so many people key in on that, myself especially, is I almost wonder, you know, if that was an instance of, you know, a writer always kind of puts something of themselves in there, but it seems like that's something that is like very personal to you, because I've even thought about that, and I don't think it's a spoiler really, because he's just talking about where he is in his life.
Yeah.
But now that he's older, he's like, you know, I don't feel that old. He's like, I still feel like that same young, invincible person. And that resonated with me. Like, you know, I'm not old by any stretch, but, you know, as I am getting older, like, I start to feel like that. Like, I don't feel a difference in how I was when I felt younger, like a late teen or something like that. I still feel like that young person. So I was wondering if that was like something that like you think about a lot, because it seems like you said, most readers key in on it, and that's why I kind of went like that, because that was something that resonated with me too.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, definitely something I think about. It's like, without trying to seem too conceited, I think that scene is probably some of my best writing, because in some ways I've been for a while sort of looking for somewhere to explore that idea through character, and then obviously with the character of Clay, it was the obvious place to do it. It actually started having a conversation, sitting around with a few mates, and a few beers and whiskeys into the evening, and I ended up going on this bit of a rant about that, because I can't even remember how it started, but it basically comes down to the fact that you get to about somewhere around 20, 25, and your sort of personality is pretty much molded. You'll get hopefully wiser as you get older. You'll hopefully get smarter about things. You know, you might get more informed about things or whatever. But the person you are, the core of who you are and how you see yourself, your sort of mental mirror, is pretty much set at that point. And you get into your 30s and then your 40s, and I'm now into my 50s. And it's like, even though I know more and I think differently, or I might have changed some ideas about stuff, fundamentally that personality is still the same as when I was 22 years old. Like, that's who I was. That's who I formed into, and that's kind of what Clay's getting at in that sort of in that monologue he gives to. And it's a perfect situation to do it because of the threat and the situation they're in at that point in time. But yeah, we were a few drinks in, and I don't know how it started, but I started going on about that. And you know, a couple of my mates are always sort of taking the piss out of the fact that I write books, and one of the things that they say, if I go off on one or something, one of them will look around and go, "You should write that down, mate," which is basically a way of saying, just shut up and put it in a book. You're bouncing books off us here, because I'll go off on one. And that was one of those things. And I was like, actually, you know what? I should. That would be a really interesting sort of idea and mindset to put into the character of an older character in a book. And so I was sitting there waiting for an older character to come along. And as soon as I started working on Blood Covenant, working on the family and figuring out who was who in the family, and there's, the recently widowed grandfather, who's sort of like the patriarch of the family. It's like, oh fuck, there it is. That's the guy. This is where I can explore this idea. And I mean, Clay is my favorite character in Blood Covenant. I've got a soft spot for a lot of the characters in that book, but like I said, it's quite a few. It's an ensemble cast, and I really started vibing with Clay. The old man in me was sort of coming out in Clay. Like, he's a lot older than I am. He's in his, well into his 70s and everything else. But yeah, I really like to explore those kind of ideas through characters like that. And so yeah, that scene, it came from ramblings years ago that eventually found a voice in Clay and Black Covenant.
Clay resonates with me really heavily because I'm old, but mainly it's like those certain things, like, okay, I just turned 60 last month, but as Rich was saying, and we've been talking about, in my mind, I'm still 20. And don't fucking tell me otherwise. It's like
Exactly.
On my 60th birthday, I'm going to carry groceries in, and my stepdaughter's husband says, "Hey, let me help you with that, buddy." And I'm like, "No, fuck you, I got it."
I don't need any help. Yeah.
Because it's like you start going through that little bit of mentality, or you think I'm old. Fuck you. Yeah. I'm still, I still can't get ready.
There's three ages, as far as I'm concerned. There are three ages. There's a chronological age that you can do nothing about. That's just time passing. We're all fucked in that respect.
Mm-hmm.
And otherwise, you've got a physical age and a mental age, and those are things that you've got some control over. Like if you, with your physical age, you can do your best to stay in shape and to eat well, to get enough sleep and all that stuff, and you can slow down the physical age. But the one you have most control over is the mental age. And if you start thinking, fuck, I'm getting old, I'm getting sore, I can't do this anymore, then you are a self-fulfilling prophecy. But if your mindset is like, no, fuck it, I don't care, I'm 50, I'm 60, I'm 70, I don't care, I'm going to do what I can do, and all the time you push to continue to do things, most of the time in the first instance, that's a mental decision. So yeah, absolutely right. Fuck you, don't carry my groceries, I got it.
And it's a family thing. My dad is 90 years old, and he's 90 years old because he never believed he's old. And he's finally starting to act like he's old at 90, but yeah,
that's the chronological age catching up with. You get to a point where there's nothing you can do about it.
And yet, and then I know younger people who are like, I'm so broken, I just can't do things anymore. And it's like, yeah, well, and that's just going to keep going that way as long as you keep thinking that, man, I'm 60 and I'm healthier than you. So,
it's a weird thing. I mean, I know people in their 30s and 40s who start talking about aging, and it's like, fuck me.
Right. I know.
You're not supposed to be talking about aging right yet, like
right. And the thing is even if you are in less than adequate shape when you're 30, for whatever reason, I was too. I was in terrible fucking shape when I was in my 30s, but I'm in the best shape of my life now, so of my adult life anyway, so it's like, everything is reversible, everything is, not totally, but
there are some things, there are some physical issues obviously that people can't get around, don't have control of, but equally the best thing you can do is to try to keep positive mental attitude about everything you still can do, because it's the old adage, it was a strength to recognize the things I can't change and the strength to change the ones I can, or whatever, however that goes. It's like, I think that's really important. There are some things that you simply can't do, but a lot of stuff, it is, at least as I've sort of found in life, more often than not, a lot of stuff people think they can't do, it's like, well, actually you can. It might be really fucking hard, but you can. And that's recognizing the things you really can't do and accepting those while putting in the work required for the things you can do. That's what's really important. And as is the case with almost everything in life, the stuff that's important is work. One way or another, it takes mental fortitude, it takes effort, it takes discipline and focus and whatever else. I mean, this is the martial artist in me coming out, I suppose, but it's not going to come easy. Nothing worth having is going to come easy, whether it's pursuing a life in the arts or pursuing a career or staying fucking healthy into your 60s, 70s, 80s. Like, it takes work, it takes discipline and effort and work, and that starts with the mindset of, I'm going to do the work.
Yep. And I only studied martial arts for a brief time, but I'm an old stubborn fucker, and I can tell you it's the same mindset. It's like, no, you're not going to stop me, and it's a good, healthy mindset to have, because it keeps you positive, even in
that's it. A good degree of stubbornness and righteous anger can go a long way in pushing.
Kind of when you were saying about how, like, off the hard work thing, I was listening to a podcast today by Craig Finn of the band The Hold Steady, and he does a podcast kind of about memory called That's How I Remember It. And it was a great episode, which I'll admit I haven't read any of his books yet. I want to, because I've been hearing about him a ton, and I hope I don't mispronounce his name, but I think even if I do, people know. There's a writer, Willie Valutin, or Valatin, or however you say it, but he kind of writes like stories about, like people kind of like on the fringes of society, I guess you would say, kind of like in the Pacific Northwest and stuff. But something that I found interesting, like touching on the hard work thing, is he was talking to Craig kind of about like his process in writing books and like what he likes about it. And he's also a musician, but he said he liked writing the novel because he said, you can do it kind of in private and no one like sees you like fail. He's like, all you have to do is make it once and nobody needs to know about like the 455 times you didn't make it or something. And that just struck me as like very profound, and kind of like what you said about like the hard work of it all is like, that's kind of what makes it, and anything worth having, is putting in that work, as long as you kind of stick with it.
I think it's important to bear in mind as well, if you are trying to do stuff as well, because you see it a lot of sort of with the public life that we have, and like with the sort of social media life, people see the successes, right? They see, oh, so he's got another book coming out, oh, another story getting published, and it's like, so yeah, but that's because I'm telling you about this one that's getting published, not the 30 rejections I had previous to this. And it's like, if you work hard, you might get rejected 30 times in a year. If you don't work so hard, it might take you 10 years to get 30 rejections, but you're still going to get 30 rejections before you get an acceptance. And so for someone who looks like they're just winning, every once in a while, someone comes along who just rides a wave of popularity for no really discernible reason. There's lots of talented people out there, and some people just catch a wave and there's no rhyme or reason to it. We'd all do it if there was a way to figure it out. Yeah. But for the vast majority of people, doesn't matter how frequently you're seeing successes, there's a shit ton of failure going on as well, because that's just life in the arts, right? That's just what happens. And we talk about the good stuff that's happening. We don't post every time something bad happens, because you'd just be like constantly whinging. Like with writing in particular, and it's probably the same with music and art and everything else. You spend most of your time trying and failing for the occasional success that you get. One of the most important lessons that I learned really early on, somebody said to me, what doesn't matter what you're doing, just remember that rejection is the default. And it's what you're trying to do is catch the odd one out every now and then where you don't get rejected. Don't think that you do stuff and it gets accepted and sometimes you don't. It's like, no, you do stuff and it gets rejected. That's the norm, because that's the process. And then every once in a while, something lands, right place, right time, and you slowly build. And with any luck, you get to a point where you start getting rejected a bit less. But I mean, what are we, January, whatever it is, 18th today? I haven't had any rejections this year, but I've had any acceptances this year, but I've already had 3 rejections for stuff that was going on end of last year and whatever else. So, you know, Recall's coming out at the end of February. That's great. I'm going to be talking about a new book, and everybody's, oh, we've got another book out there, great, which is cool. But so far this year, I've had nothing but rejection. So that's the process. That's how it goes. But you've got to keep working.
Yeah, and it's kind of like, I mean, I've gotten to a stage now because I'm the same boat. You know, I've not been accepted yet this year anywhere, but I have had 4 rejections, so it's, you know, part and parcel. But I've also got myself to a stage because what you're saying is very, very true. It's a lot easier to come by rejections than it is to come by acceptances. So it's important to look at the work that you feel is your best work and consider that as success, regardless of whether people have accepted it or not.
Yeah, because I mean, rejection is not rejection of you, the person, and it's not often a rejection of the work itself. It's just a rejection of that particular work at that particular time. Like, you can, to some degree, as your career sort of builds and as you grow, you get better at things. You recognize what's good and what's not, and you sort of do get objectively better, hopefully. But more often than not, getting anything accepted is the right story landing with the right editor at the right time. It's that sort of combination of luck happening, because some amazing stories never get published, or some amazing stories get rejected a whole bunch of times before they get accepted, and some frankly ordinary stories, nothing special about them at all, get accepted early on because they just happened to nail one particular thing that was being looked for at that point in time. So you have to have a thick skin in the game, but you just have to remember that whatever you're working on, if you're making the thing as best you can do, if you're writing the best story you can write and you're putting it out there, that's the success. Everything else that comes after that is or isn't gravy.
Yeah, and Rich talked about it last week, but I'll happily bring it up again. He has a story he just recently published that just basically was a trunk story for a decade or something, you know, but he believed in it and he kept doing it. And so
yeah,
you know,
my record is 33. I had a short story accepted on its 33rd submission. It had been rejected 32 times. And it changed. I took some editorial advice here and there, and you know, sometimes it just gets bounced and you don't know anything about it. You have a little look over, you send it out again. A couple of times I got comments on it, and I took those on board and did little rewrites and whatever. But that story eventually got published on its 33rd incarnation. It paid quite well when it got published, and it got nominated. It didn't win an award, but it got nominated for an Australian award. So it's like clearly not a bad story, but it took 33 attempts to find it a home. So yeah, and congratulations on you, Rich. Well done getting something out there, especially if you previously chunked it.
Thank you. Yeah, there was a couple like that, and thank you for mentioning that, Shane. Like it, and that's like, as a newer writer, and that's what's interesting is, you know, and that's why, like, we've brought it up a couple of times through other episodes about that, but I feel like that's one of the, I mean, less spoken about. Like, even though all of us that are kind of, you know, either writers or involved with, you know, book reviewing and all of that, like, we're aware of it, but like, it's always something, especially like for newer writers, that you don't really think about, because you think about like, oh, you know, all of my favorite writers, like you kind of said, Alan, it seems like everything is like all gravy, like, oh, they're putting out a ton of books. But that's why I don't mind mentioning it, even though some people are probably like, oh my God, this is like the 30th time they've mentioned that. I think it's important for like people just starting out to realize, you know, you might have a great story, but that doesn't mean it's going to get accepted right away. It might take, you know, a whole bunch of edits or retooling and things like that.
Well, you might cycle around, you know, like you do get better, obviously. Ideally, you're learning the whole time and you're improving, and every time you look at a story with improved eyes, you can hopefully find something about it that gets better. And you do get to a point in a career where you are just sort of better at the job and you're better at figuring out what works in what place. And so you might get, because you've sort of put in the hard yards and you've established yourself and established a name a bit, then you might sort of actually get asked for some things, and that kind of ups your acceptance rate, because if you get invited into something, obviously a lot more likely you'll be accepted than if you just cold call on a thing. And so the whole thing is kind of self-perpetuating, but you still have to go through that process. You're still in that crucible of sort of writing, submitting, being rejected, which is why I think it's important. Like, we're in the face of publishing is changing all the time, and it's never been easier to publish and to be published, and there's never been more noise out there at the same time. But I think that it's really important for people to go through that sort of crucible of submission and rejection, because it does form you into a better writer. Like, just because you can publish doesn't mean you should, kind of thing. Like, straight off the bat, it's very tempting to put stuff out there because it's so easy to do. And sometimes people do it and they do a tremendous job of it. And, you know, I do a bit of my own publishing as well. I self-publish some of my stuff while I work with publishers most of the time, because I'm lazy in that respect. It's a lot more work to do your own. But
it really is.
It really, and I feel like a lot more people need to have that experience of that submission and rejection and that process, because it kind of helps to build your skin, but it also helps to build your skills. It makes you look again at things. If you get a form rejection, it's just a rejection. Every once in a while, though, you might get a comment, and the tiniest comment can just open your eye to something and go, oh, okay, make you look at something in a different way. And every one of those just builds your skill as a writer and builds your skill as sort of a storyteller, what something might need that you wouldn't have thought of before. And so by going through that process, then it hopefully sort of basically forms you into a better person. You know, back to the martial arts technique, where they talk, you know, I don't fear the person who knows 10,000 kicks. I fear the person who knows one kick but has practiced 10,000 times. It's like that principle at work. If all you're doing is you just write and send it out, and then don't think about it, you just sort of publish everything that comes out, you never get to have that repetition that's needed to get good. So yeah, I'm rambling a bit, but for me, that's kind of how it works. It's really like rejection is a very important part of a writing career, basically.
Yeah, it really is. And for many reasons, like you say, to develop that skin and also to learn to see with different eyes. Also, every now, like with me, when I started writing, I'd been told that so many times. I think I had been told that by you in a conversation we had on the original iteration of this show. But the first time I submitted to a paying market, I submitted to the biggest paying market, because you know, in poetry circles, I submitted to Poetry Magazine, the ridiculously, you can't be in this unless you're Walt Whitman magazine, you know. It's like, and I've done it about 8 times since then. But there's some encouragement there too, because the first couple times they just, you know, we can't use this. And then it started turning to, we hope you'll submit something again, you know, and that's still where it's at. But
that's nice.
Like, okay,
it's not much feedback, but it is feedback, because they don't have to do that, do they? They don't have to say, please send us something again. They just have to say, sorry, this is not for us.
Right. You know, but the adverse side to that is you learn about yourself as you go too. Like you said, as you gain more experience, I know a lot more about what's a better poem now than I did then. by a long shot, even though I'd been writing it forever. And I also find myself sometimes hideously embarrassed thinking about some of the shit I did submit.
I know what you mean, right? But I think it's a really important point to never be embarrassed about the shit you submitted, because we've all done it. We've all sent some absolute fucking dogs out into the world. But that was the process that got you to where you are now, right? You had the fortitude to do something and to send it out and to take a shot, and that's what formed you into what you became. So I absolutely get it. You know, sometimes you look at stuff, you're like, oh my god, but that was really important. It was, and what you said too about submitting to the highest paying place, absolutely, always submit from the top down. You can't sell to the full pro paying markets. You get through a few of those, you go to the semi pros or whatever, but always go from the top down, because somebody else might see what you're doing and go, yeah, I like it, and you land a pro sale, which is always just epic. Or you might get some feedback from pro editors, which is equally epic in its own way. And you just keep sort of working your way down until you find a home for a thing. But if all you ever do is aim at the low tier, then you might find that you're starting to get quite a decent success rate at the low tier, but you're never going to become who you could be, because you're never pushing into that higher realm of sort of challenge and feedback and stuff like that. So yeah, absolutely, always be proud of the fact that you wrote something and send it out there, and always submit from the top down.
Yeah, because very few of us, if any of us, really just get discovered. I mean, even Stephen King didn't get discovered, you know.
I mean, every once in a while someone comes along who just seems to just hit a zeitgeist, you know. They just kind of, whatever reason, you get someone who's like, okay, I've never heard of them before, and they'll be like, oh my god, I can't believe my debut novella is doing so well, and it won a Nebula, or you know, a Hugo or whatever. It happens once in a while, and there's no real reason for it. I mean, obviously it's a good story, but there's thousands of really good stories out there. It's not just that it was a good story that did it. It was whatever sort of particular point in time that it hit, and it just landed right. But you hear a lot about those because those are the odd ones out. So every one of those, there's 1,000 of us just jobbing, just ticking along and doing the thing. And we all want the lightning strike. We all want to have the big breakout, something or other. For most of us, it doesn't happen. For most of us, it's a hopefully slowly continuous upwards trajectory, and, you know, back catalog sales that, you know, continually sort of build a career and build a name, and hopefully you get somewhere at some point. Most of us don't get the lightning strike success. Those are the ones you hear about because they are lightning strikes. But there's no shame in just plugging along and just being a journeyman writer, you know, just being a jobbing writer and just building the career as you go. So
and hearing kind of that, like, you know, because it is a lot of hard work, but also, like you said, it's a million other factors. You need that hard work to get there, but there's so many other factors, and that's why it seems like one of those, you know, kind of like stereotype form things of advice, like write what you want to read. But I feel like that's why it's kind of important, because if it's already going to be kind of, you know, hard work plus a lot of luck, you might as well write whatever interests you the most.
Yeah.
And sometimes, like, not even consciously, like one of my submissions that I was the most proud of was a nonfiction thing I submitted to the Fump Truck anthology, and about, you know, and shameless plug because the inauguration's coming up, and you know, I think it would make him very happy to know that he has a book about him on trending on Amazon. But they're open letters, essays, fiction, poetry, artwork, and other creations for and inspired by the 45th crossed out 47th president of the divided states of America. All that to say is, I wrote that nonfiction piece because I saw the call for that, but I wasn't really concerned about whether or not it was going to be put in there. And I kind of just wrote from the heart, so to speak, and then just cleaned it up after. And it was the easiest thing I had to write, but also like the acceptance I was most proud of, because it was almost like, I wanted it to be in there, but it was more important to me the journey of like writing it for myself. And then, like you said, all the stuff that comes after is gravy. But that's why it seems like, you know, because everyone will see like writing advice, and writing advice is different for everyone. But when you say like, oh, kind of like write what you know or write from your experience, it's almost like one of those fortune cookie type, you know, like, oh yeah, okay. But it really does make a difference, I think.
I think it does. I think it's twofold as well. Like, on the one hand, write what you know, sure, but also know what you write about. So if you don't really know it, but you want to explore it in your writing, find out about it, get it right. And you know, there's a lot of fun. Research for fiction is one of the most fun times I have. Like, sometimes a writing day will start with me going, oh, I just need to check and 6 hours later I'm, you know, neck deep in a YouTube hole about all kinds of shit that I do, and I've got notes coming up, all this stuff. So, you know, it's like, so yeah, know what you're writing about is important, and writing the stories you want to read is important as well. Like David Lynch, we just got the news yesterday that David Lynch died, and like, that's a massive fucking loss to cinema and to the creative world. And he is the greatest example of basically fuck you to people telling him what he should do. Like, be freaking weird. Like, that's David Lynch's like, that's the Lynch kind of mindset, is just be weird and do what you want to do, and you will find an audience for it. And to some degree, you can try to write what you think people want, and you can write with a more sort of commercial or mainstream sort of sensibility, and you may be successful, and you may make some sort of good money at that if that's what you're aiming to do. And more power to you if it works like that. There's a lot of people who do write to formula, and they write what they think will be commercially more viable. But for me, the art of it is what's important, and the expression and the self-expression is what's important in the creation of art. And I would rather write a story that really meant a lot to me and gets 100 readers than a story that I was trying to follow some sort of formula and create something for people that then gets 1,000 readers. Like, there's way more value in that 100 readers who get what I wanted to do than 1,000 readers where I've done what they wanted me to do. It's really important, I think. Dallas Smith, like Jack Ketchum said, one of the sort of real piece of advice he always had, he says, if you really want to get a story told, he goes, right from the wound, look for the places where you hurt or where you see hurt, and write straight out of that sort of fresh wound. Find, you know, really explore that deep visceral nature, because that's the stuff that will come out and will come across well. That's the stuff where you'll convince people that they're really on a journey, even if it's not something they can directly relate to. They will recognize where it relates to the writer through the story, and that's really important. So yeah, it would be nice to sell a lot more books and be a lot more commercially successful, but if it came at the cost of what I wanted to write, it wouldn't be any good. It's like with my martial arts. I teach a very traditional system of kung fu. I could very easily simplify and organize what I'm teaching into a straight white belt to black belt system, guarantee black belts in 24 months, sign up for a year, buy a uniform, what we generally refer to as a McDojo these days. I could very easily do that and open a school near Hobart and probably make a decent living at it, because I know my stuff, and I could simplify it, and I could commercialize it, and I could probably make a lot of money. Teaching it the traditional way and the traditional system is a much more niche area, and it's much harder to draw people in who are prepared to put in the work and the focus that's required for that kind of a system. But I would always much rather have a smaller school teaching the right stuff, what my teacher taught me, and, you know, protecting his legacy, than commercializing what I know in order to get more students and make more money. So this is why, you know, artistic integrity and big bank balances are rarely exist at the same time. But yeah,
isn't that the truth?
Yeah.
But that's the better teacher, in my opinion. Yeah, exactly. Like you say, artistic integrity. Like, even my teacher, the first thing he ever told me is, do you want to learn do you want to learn karate in a year? And I said, if I can. He said, well, then go someplace else, because it's going to take you years. Granted, I didn't give the years to it. I'm a pretty good blocker. The important part, I can keep from getting punched.
I remember it was Hoist Gracie. I think it was from the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guys. I think it was Hoist Gracie who said the black belt covers the first 2 inches of your ass, and the rest of it's up to you. That's where That's where you have to put in the years and the hours and the training. He goes, you can earn yourself a black belt. It doesn't mean shit unless you can actually do stuff. Like the belt and the ability, they're not the same thing.
Yeah, but learning to dance is one thing, but learning to take on a partner is a whole other thing.
Yeah.
I never had the aggression in me to be a good fighter, though. But really good runner, really good blocker.
Well, in the long run, it's the better way to go. When I teach kids class, they get into the sort of swing of it to some degree. But we've always got this thing. So, what's the first rule of self-defense? And they all go, run away. What's the second rule of self-defense? Only fight till you can run away. Okay, let's go. And it's like, because you really got to get this mindset into the kids. It's like you're not here to learn how to just have drag out brawls with people. You're here to learn an art in the first instance, and self-expression and discipline, whatever else. Yes, you're going to get self-defense skills, but the best self-defense is just don't fucking be there, because there's nothing good about fighting, So yeah,
exactly. Avoid the situation or extract yourself from the situation.
That's it. Yeah.
So anyway, we always have to have fight talk on the Ink Heist podcast, because
well, that's what's funny, the Ink Heist part, and then Blood Covenant opening with a bank heist. I did think that was pretty funny.
So anything else you desperately want to talk about before we start winding this up and letting you get on with your day? I know you're right in the middle of your afternoon here.
Yeah. Saturday afternoon, my wife and kid have just walked down to town to go and get some shopping and stuff. So I think the next thing for me is to take the dogs for a walk, which would be nice. They're both here, lying here, sort of looking at me like, "Come on, what's going on?" I think that's the next day to my Saturday. Yeah, walking the dog. Yeah, I'm talking to you. Yeah. But no, it's been nice to chat. I don't think, this is the sort of thing I can sit here and talk shit all day long. It's nice to just kind of hang out and talk with stuff. So
I'm the same way. I can do this for hours and hours and hours and hours, but my wife would cut parts off of me eventually.
Exactly.
Rich, what else for you?
Nothing for me. Just it was great hanging out with you guys. Thanks for stopping by, Alan. And
Thanks,
anybody listening, pick up Blood Covenant, and pretty soon Recall will be out, right? When does that come out again? Like the omnibus edition?
Yeah, so the novellas are out of print now, so unless you can pick those up secondhand anywhere, they're done. But the omnibus edition Recall is dropping on February the 25th. It's got an amazing cover by Sabercore Art. Wendy Muchless at Sabercore did it. If you've seen the cover of Manifest Recall, the first of the novellas, they did that cover, and we got them back to do the Recall omnibus. So it's kind of a homage to that cover. It's fucking brilliant. It's outstanding. I think Soblo are gonna sort of reveal that at the start of next week. So yeah, keep an eye on the socials. I think that will be when pre-orders open as well. And it's out at the end of February. 25th, I think, is officially the release day.
Okay, well, thank you, Alan. It's always great to talk to you. You can come and be here anytime you want to.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
After Recall comes out, we'll have you back on to remind people what's up with that book too. So
yeah, cool. Anytime. Happy to come along.
Cool. All right, man. We'll let you go, and we'll see you next time. I'll send you a link for this once I get around to putting shit together. And
easy. Good job.
All right.
Sounds good.
Thanks, guys.
Good night, guys.
Anytime.